This video, we're going to show you how to create your own NX plugin, which to get started is as simple as going into NX console, clicking generate, typing in NX plugin, and then type in the name of our plugin, which in our case, we're going to be creating a plugin for Playwright in this video. I'll hit run, and just like that, we've created an NX plugin. So in the rest of this video, we're going to explain the benefits and mechanics of having your own NX plugins. We're going to create our own executors, and then we're going to create some of our own generators, and then we're going to publish our plugin to the NPM registry so we can use it in other projects. When we think about what NX is, we can break it down into two pieces, the core of NX and plugins. At the core, we have the engine of NX, which includes NX's ability to determine a project graph of how your workspace's projects depend on each other, and affected capabilities to know which projects were changed and affected by your latest commit, as well as a mechanism to cache the results of your build and test commands based on your source code. These are the domain-agnostic pieces of NX. They work for any JavaScript framework, for both front-end and back-end code, and even for other languages. In fact, with the use NX flag we've built into Lerna, we're effectively using the same NX core engine for Lerna workspaces as well. But in this video, we're going to look at how we can further enhance this core with an NX workspace by bringing in NX plugins to bring in domain-specific generators and executors to our workspace, as well as how we can build our own plugins when we want to add NX support for a tool that doesn't have official support yet, like Playwright. So let's get started first by looking at NX executors. To help understand executors, let's start by considering the project JSON file for our example ETE project, particularly the target section. When we first generated our React app, we initially created it using the Narwhal Cypress plugin for end-to-end testing. We can see in the executor property of the end-to-end target where Narwhal Cypress is the plugin name and E2E is the name of the executor to use from that plugin. The options that we see set for the ETE target here are also dictated by the Narwhal Cypress plugin and provide a way to parameterize the executor to run in different modes. We'll use executor options later to create both an E2E and a debug target for Playwright using the same Playwright executor. Then to run our target via the NX CLI, we start with NX, and then we use the intended target name, followed by the project name, and finally, any option overrides to add. So maybe in this case, instead of using the default Pokédex serve for our dev server target as listed in the project JSON, we want to run our end-to-end test against some server-side rendered web server. So we'll add that override below. So our CLI syntax then becomes NX, target name, project name, and then any option overrides. Let's take a look at our actual project JSON now for our Pokédex ETE project. And be sure to check out this code in the linked repo if you'd like to follow along closer. In our previous video, we already adjusted our ETE project to use Playwright, but rather than creating our own executors, we used the Narwhal workspace run a commands executor to accomplish this. Before we move on to create our own executors, I wanted to mention that using run commands is a perfectly valid option and to mention the trade-offs of using run commands versus running your own executor. In the pros column for custom executors is that it allows us to standardize the way we'll use Playwright across our NX workspace, and it helps encapsulate knowledge of how to configure Playwright. In the custom executor scenario, one engineer needs to understand how Playwright gets configured, and everyone else can just use the exposed options of the Playwright executor to work with it. In the cons column, Playwright was not made with NX in mind, which may become troublesome for researching issues if you run into unexpected complications around Playwright. Also, we're generally limited to the options that we build into the executor, which likely won't be fully comprehensive versus the full extent of what Playwright can do as a tool. So keep those trade-offs in mind when deciding whether it's worth it for you to make your own custom plugins. But let's say we've decided it makes sense for us to make our own Playwright plugin. The first thing to consider is which executors we'll need to create and which options are needed. Looking back at our project JSON, I think that what we'll need is two executors, Playwright and showReport. And our Playwright executor will need an option for a config file, whether to run in debug mode or not, a timeout option, and a project option. Let's get into code now and start making these executors, starting with our Playwright executor. First, we'll remove the build executor that was generated for us at the start of this video. Then we'll use the executor generator from the NX plugins plugin to make our Playwright executor. We'll start by adding each of our options into the properties field of our schema JSON file, starting with Playwright config, which is the path to the Playwright config file. And then debug, which is whether we should enable debug mode. And project, which is the name of the project, the Playwright project to run, for example, Chromium or WebKit or etc. And finally, timeout, which is the timeout for each test in milliseconds, and use 0 to remove timeout. Our next step is to create a TypeScript interface for the options we added to our schema in our schema.json file. Our Playwright config is an optional string. Debug is an optional Boolean. Project is an optional string. And finally, timeout is an optional number. Now we made that interface so that inside of our executor file here, we could use it. So you see here in the boilerplate that was generated for us, we can see our run executor function is exported from this file, with the options being that Playwright executor schema. As we can see, that has the options here we just specified in that file. So in TypeScript, we're going to define what NX should run when this executor is called. So to write our implementation for this executor, we're going to use execseek to run the Playwright command as we would from a terminal. And we're going to have, for now, this hypothetical git command working directory for Playwright. We're actually going to want to use this in our show report executor as well. So we're going to push it down into a utils file that we'll create next. We also imported here the executor context from the narwhal dev kit. We'll see that is the second argument that's being passed into our run executor command. When NX runs our executor, it'll pass the executor context as its second argument here. So we'll have access to the context that way. To get started with writing this executor, we'll get our command working directory from our hypothetical function. Again, we'll implement that next. And then we'll get our args from the options. See, we have the stub for that function here for now. Let's keep going with the main thread to keep with the train of thought. And then we're going to create our command by running playwright test. So normally that's the command we would run from the terminal. And we're going to concat that with any arguments that we've created from the options. And just using join with the empty space here to create a string for the command to run. Once that's done, we'll run execseek on that command, passing in standard IO inherit. So we'll be able to forward standard IO from the command being run and passing in the command working directory that we'll get again from our stubbed out function. And then the last step is just to record success as true. So in the case where something fails here, the playwright test will throw the error and will automatically get a failure here, so we won't need to actually catch that and return false. NX will handle that for us. So that's our main thread. Let's look at how we can get our arguments from the options here. So we've already split this out into our function. So we'll start with our args array, which is just an empty array for now. And then we're just going to go through the options. So starting with playwright config, if playwright config is there, we'll push on the -c option with the path to the playwright config. Now if the project is set, we'll push -- project with the actual project that was passed in. Remember, this would be like Chromium or WebKit. So this is to override the projects that are usually specified in the playwright config to say we only care about this one project for this run, which we'll be using for our debug target. Speaking of debug, next one is debug. So if the debug is set, we're going to push on --debug to the CLI commands. And finally, if timeout's there, we're going to push on --timeout equals and then the timeout value. And finally, just return those args. So now to create our git command working directory for playwright via the utils file. So we're going to put that inside of executors because this is a utility for our executor we'll also be using in show report. So we'll make a new file here called utils.ts. I'm just going to paste in the code for now. And so you can see the context here that we pass in. This is actually a subset of the actual type, which is the executor context. But the pieces we care about of the context are a workspace, which is includes a projects, which is a record of string to a root. So if we take a look at our workspace JSON file, put it over on the right-hand side here, our workspace is helping informing NX where each one of our projects is, which specifies the root for where each one of these projects lives. So we can see for the Playwright plugin, for example, here's the root. And for the one we actually care about, which is our Pokedex E2E, the root would be right there. So this happens to also be the command working directory that we care about. So what we're going to do is take that context and get the workspace project. And based off the project name that we're executing inside, we're going to then return the root, which is again just this app/pokedex.ete. So in the case where we're running our Playwright executor inside of the Pokedex E2E, the name for that would be right here inside of the workspace JSON, so Pokedex E2E. And that would be passed in the context via the project name. So as you can see, what this is doing is really getting us from what's our project name? Okay, let's get to the root. And the root, again, is what we want to run as our command working directory for Playwright, so that's what we return. So our last step, and this is optional, but we're going to go over it real quick, is we could write some unit tests for our executor here. So we've already stubbed some of this out via the generator we ran. I'm going to paste in a test here so we can gloss over it quickly. So this is just creating a mock context. We are going to mock out exec_sync from the child process. That's kind of going to be our test case to see what exec_sync was called with. So I have a test here for each one of our options and for empty options. We could be more exhaustive with this if we like, but essentially what we're doing is creating an option. So this is what we'd be calling the CLI with, but using the actual interface we specified. We're going to wait the results of the executor, and then we're going to expect our command to have been called with the correct options, or the correct string rather, for what is passed to exec_sync. So if we go to this, expect command to have been called, this is just wrapping our exec_sync mock and asserting that it was called with the right options here. So I'm going to come in and just run our tests here. Boom. And we can see that our tests are passing. So with that confidence, let's go ahead and adjust our actual Pokedex E2E project now. So coming into our Pokedex E2E project, we can now open up the project JSON. And I'm just going to paste over the E2E target here with our new executor. So notice the name follows, this is the name of our workspace. You can see it matches the path name we have up at the top here. And then this is the name of our plugin. So again, that is if we look at our libs, the Playwright plugin right here, that's where that matches. And then Playwright is the name of our executor. If we want to see where that's specified, it's here in the file structure, but also the file structure actually doesn't matter. It's here inside of our executor's JSON file where we're going to actually tie these things together in terms of where the implementation lies and where the schema lies. So for our options here, we're going to pass in the Playwright config. So we can see that matches the option we had here in our TypeScript. And we're going to pass it in Playwright config.ts, which when we look inside of our Pokedex here, that's right here. So this would be helpful in the case where we wanted to have multiple configs. We could possibly do that here with some other project. It doesn't matter much for this one though. But now with that in place, we can run npx nx_ete Pokedex E2E. We are now using our custom executor to run Playwright. So that's awesome. And success. So now that we've adjusted our E2E target, we should be able to do the same thing for our debug. So I'm just going to copy this. We're going to dump this in here, change the name to debug, like so. Let's pull up our schema TS. So we're going to keep that same Playwright config, but we're going to use these additional ones to override it. So I'm just going to copy these ones, drop them in here. For debug, we have true. Place that with a comma. For project, we wanted to run this only on Chromium, I believe, inside of debug. because when we're debugging, we want to limit it to just the one browser. And for timeout, we want to set this to 0 so that we never time out while we're debugging. So I'm going to hit save there, and now we can run npx nx debug on Pokedex ETE. Project here, Chromium. Need to adjust that. All right, let's try that again. Cool. So on my other monitor, let me just drag it over. We opened up Playwright in our nice debug mode here. So we should be able to step through and run all these tests as expected. Cool. That worked. So now that we have our first executor working for both our end-to-end and debug targets, we're going to want to create our new executor here for show report. So previously we had been running a different command from the terminal in order to run this via run commands. So we're just going to create a new executor here just to run this command. And this one, as we had said before, doesn't have any options, so this one will be much easier. So we'll go to generate a new executor. Executor name is show report. Project is our Playwright plugin. And this one will be run Playwright show report. Hit run on that, and that will generate for us our new executor here, show report. There is no options here inside the schema that we'll need, so we can leave these two files alone. And here inside the run executor, I'm going to grab a couple lines of code here to paste them in, and we'll just go over them real quick. We're going to do the same thing we had done before, getting our command working directory for Playwright. We'll need to also pass in the context here, which is an executor context from the Narwhal dev kit. And then we'll run exec sync from the child process. And because this one doesn't have any options, we're just going to statically run Playwright show report, Playwright report. So the second option here is just specifying where to find the information to show the report on. So inside of our Playwright config for our Pokedex ETE here, we can see we had set some extra reporters here for Playwright, specifying the output folder here, Playwright report. We'll need to remember this when we run our generators to make sure we add this line in here, because what we're telling Playwright here to do is when we run Playwright, it's going to dump our output here into Playwright report. And then as we run our executor here to show the report, we're passing it the path to get to where the report should lie. So we pass in the command working directory again, pass through standard IO via inherit, and then we're returning success is true. So easy peasy there. Let's hit save, and we're going to go to our project.json file here, and inside of show report, we're going to use the executor. I'm going to grab it from here because most of this is the same. It's just instead of Playwright, here we have show report. Again, let's take a look at our executor.json file just to reinforce where that is, right here, and which ties to the implementation and the schema. Looks good. And then we don't need any options here, so I'll remove that. Hit the save, and we'll be able to give it a shot. We'll run npx nx show report on the Pokedex ETE. Boom. And here on my other monitor it opened up, but we can see there's our report. Perfect. So that's it for executors. Let's move on into generators next. In NX, generators amount to code generation scripts. These are a great way to both standardize your workspace and offload domain-specific knowledge like how do I set up a Playwright ETE project again via automation. If you recall our previous video when we set up Playwright, we had to do a decent amount of adjustments to get everything in proper working order. Our goal with these generators is to automate that process. To do so, we're going to split up Playwright generation into two pieces. The first is the init generator, which we expect to run at the time we first install the Playwright plugin. And the second is a Playwright project, which we'd expect to run each time we want to create a new end-to-end project with Playwright. So let's get started first with the init generator. we're going to go into our generators and we're going to remove the one that was created for us automatically. So we'll move the file to trash. We're also going to jump into our generators JSON and remove the boilerplate one from here as well. And then we're going to open up the NX console and we're going to generate a new generator via the NX plugin. The name is init. The project is Playwright plugin. So as we recall from the graphic, the goal of this generator is to first install our dependencies on @playwright/tests and also to adjust our git config. So these are the two things we want to do when we first install the Playwright plugin. So we have here the boilerplate generator that was generated for us. I'm actually going to come in and dump in a piece of code here, and we'll look over it real quick. But before I get too far into that, let's look quick at our schema JSON here. I adjusted this real quick off camera to add a single property here. Optionally, we'll give our users the option to skip the package JSON, which will not add dependencies to our package JSON in case that's wanted for some reason. For example, if you're using a different version of Playwright and you want to stick to that, that's the use case for this. Similar with our executors here, we just have this TypeScript interface that's going to specify what the schema is. So again, we can see just that optional schema parameter. So coming into the code we pasted in here for our generator, just here's the top level export. We're going to take a tree. Now this tree represents a sort of like a virtual file tree that NX is going to manage as it's doing this code generation. So if you'll notice when we do stuff with the NX generator, I'm just going to pick a random plugin here and start typing into it. You'll see when we do this, it gets run with the dry run, but it knows what files are touched. So that's what this virtual file system allows us to do, is understand what the differences to the file system would be, but we haven't actually run it yet. So coming back to our generator, the two things we want to do are update our dependencies, and we only do this if that skip package JSON is not present. And then we're going to update our git ignore. So pretty much that's all it is. So as you can see, as we're going through, we're mutably changing the tree, and by the time we're done, it's just done. So that's all that's going on here. We'll see inside of the update dependencies, we're going to use some nice utility functions that are provided by the Narwhal dev kit here to just update the JSON file. So we pass in the tree, and we say, I want to update the JSON file located at package.json, and here's how I want to change it. If there are no dev dependencies, let's create a dev dependency in our package.json. And then we're going to set playwright test to be 125.1. That will make that adjustment to the tree. And then we always want to update git ignore. So we're going to take our initial contents of git ignore. Let's expand that so we can see it. So we're just going to use the tree API to read from our virtual file system the git ignore for the workspace. And that returns a buffer, so we're going to return this to string to get a string value out of that. And then we're just going to say if it already includes Playwright, we are going to want this generator to be idempotent. So if we ran it multiple times, the subsequent times we ran it wouldn't make any difference. So if we already have the Playwright git ignore section, we're just going to return. Otherwise, we're going to add the following to our git ignore. So this way, we're going to remove any kind of logging or reports that wouldn't be necessary to add to our Git repo, and let Git know that we can ignore that. And then we're going to write that back to the git ignore to the virtual file tree with the initial context plus text to add. And remember, if we had already ignored it, we would have already returned here. So that is our init, and we can see how this is really a nice API for running code generation. And it's nice that we got to see the smaller example first, because our next generator is going to be a bit more involved. Let's go ahead and make that now. We're going to make another generator here. This one's going to be called Playwright Project. And this is going to go in our Playwright plugin. We're going to say this will generate a Playwright NX project. Hit run there. And that added this new Playwright project for us. So recall when we set out for this section, there were several things we wanted to do. We wanted to optionally take a front-end project option. So this would be with the idea like our Pokédex. We would be able to tell the generator, here's the specific project we want to use, and we'll set this up inside of our Playwright config to set this up as the default web server with the front-end project serve target. So let's start there. We're going to start with the schema JSON. Here we're going to paste over the properties with ones we had specified for this. So the idea here is there'll be several optional properties here. The first one is name. So this one would be the name of the end-to-end project to create. So this is optional. So the idea here is this would be the name of the project. If this is not provided and front-end project is, so this is specifying like which React app or maybe which Angular app we should tie the end-to-end targets to, we would just take the name of that front-end project and append -ete onto that if a name is not provided. If a name is provided, we'll just use that one as the name here, like Pokédex ETE. So maybe if we wanted both a Cypress and a Playwright for some reason, we could overwrite the name here so the name doesn't clash with our Cypress one. We can optionally put some tags on here. Why not? We won't get into tagging in this video, but it's a great another system that NX provides for being able to control your project graph a bit more. And then the directory is another option that a lot of our generators have for generating new projects. The idea here is if we wanted to nest this, so it's not just at the top level of libs, but nested down within libs, we would be able to add this here, and that would be allowed to propagate through. Then let's just get rid of any required properties because we actually don't have any here. In the case where none of these are provided, we'll just create like a generically named Playwright ETE name for the project. So let's go into our schema.d.ts. The idea here is just to have this match the options that we set inside of the schema JSON. So we can see name, front-end project tags directory, all optional. Name, front-end project tags directory, all optional. So let's go into the generator code here. Before we paste over here, let's just take a look really quick at the boilerplate that was generated for us. One thing that is really nice is actually this add files function, which we call inside of the exported function here. You can see right there, add files is called towards the end of the generator. The idea here is if we look here at inside of the files directory, nested inside of our Playwright project generator in the file system, this allows us to create these template files where we can actually pass in, using this injection syntax, different options that are attached to the generator or pass through to the generator, including the normalized options. So if we take a look here, there's this normalized options function that's going to go through and figure out what our options should be. So normalized schema, as we can see here, we take everything from our schema that we had set up, but we're also adding things like the project name, the project group, the project directory, and any parse tags. So that's all set up for us by default via this boilerplate. So what we're going to do is come in, because one of the first things we had on our list of things to do inside of this was to add the same example spec files that Playwright's going to do when you run their native code generation script. So inside of here, so inside of files, we're going to add file/source, but instead of index here, we're going to add a new folder, call this one ETE. So this is where most of our projects, most of our tests are going to go. We're going to add here an example spec.txt ts underscores templates, like so. I'm going to drop in some code here. So this is just copied and pasted from what Playwright's actually going to generate in here. There's not actually any injection going on inside of this template, so we can just leave this alone. In addition to this ETE file, when you run Playwright's original generation script, they also create this test examples directory. We're going to add a new file here. This is called demo to do spec.ts. I'll add the templates here. Again, this one's just generated straight up by Playwright against one of their example projects they have out on the World Wide Web. So people can just see how the API works. So we're going to dump both of those in just because that's what Playwright does. We're trying to match that tool as best we can. So there we go. Our two examples are in place. Next piece is to generate a Playwright config file. So let's get rid of actually this index.ts, and we're going to generate here inside of files because we don't want this inside of source. We're going to call it playwright.config.ts template. And I'm going to paste in some code here and we'll go through it. So this is the Playwright config TS file that gets generated for you by Playwright, but with a couple of adjustments made here to fit our plugin's needs. The first one here is the reporter. We called this out earlier when we were looking at executors, but we're going to specify a specific location for our HTML reports to get generated to, as well as a specific location for JSON results to get generated to. And this is just to standardize this so that when we use our executor to show the report, we know exactly where it is. The other piece here is at the bottom. So everything else is just generated verbatim as it would be via Playwright. But for the web server here, we're going to specify that if a front-end project was provided via the options, we're going to give a specific web server where we're going to run nxserve and then the front-end project's name and specifically the port 9999. And this is just to avoid port collision when we're running these, so running this on a specified port. And so this is setting up our web server option if a front-end project is provided. If not, you can see we have this else here. If not, we're going to comment out the web server option, which is what Playwright does for you when you generate the project. So we're just matching what Playwright's doing here, but giving the added benefit where if a front-end project is specified, we're going to wire that up for people automatically. So you can just set up and run right away. Cool. So that's our Playwright config. The other thing we wanted to do here is generate a TS config. So I'm going to add tsconfig.ts template. We're going to get this root ts config path from our normalize options here, as well as the offset from root. So when we run the generator, our ts config is going to be all set to extend the root ts config. So that's all set up. Next piece is to touch the generator itself. So up until this point, this has all been the generated boilerplate. We're going to come in and add some pieces here. So we're going to add to the normalized schema the root ts config path and the offset from root. Remember, we use these inside of the ts config. So we're just going to figure out what those are. Inside of this normalize options, we're going to adjust that a little bit. The first adjustment here is the boilerplate assumed that name was required. That's not the case for us, so we're going to adjust this slightly here, like so. So if there is no name provided, but the front-end project was provided, we're going to set the default option name to the name of that front-end project -ete. And if neither of those are provided, we're just going to put this generic Playwright ETE tests. And then from there, most of this normalized options can stay the same. TypeScript is giving us some red squigglies here. That's because we'll need to add some pieces onto our normalized options to allow us to get the root ts config and the offset from root. So offset from root is imported from the narwhal dev kit. And we're going to take this get relative path through tsconfig. We're going to import that from narwhal workspace as well. So just a nice utility function that NX gives us to be able to set up this root tsconfig like so we can use it inside of our tsconfig. So cool. So those are set up. A lot of these are setting up options for the injection that we're running on our templates. We have our add files here, which we're not going to touch. We can just use this out of the box like we said. So it's just going to parse everything from this files directory and arrange those in the right way so that ends up in our virtual file system. The last thing we want to do here is adjust our project configuration. So right now we can see this is set up as follows, and there's just a build target here for what the generated project is going to have for a target. And that's actually not what we want, because as we had mentioned, we wanted an E2E, a debug, a show report, and a lint target here. So I'm going to paste in some of these. So starting with our end-to-end, remember this was the executor we had specified. So we'll add a root up the top here. So that's just going to get the root out of our normalized options. And then we can see if we look at our Pokedex E2E, so this is kind of the standard we're trying to generate. We're just really trying to recreate what we've done here, which as we can see, we're running the executor that matches, options matches. Outputs is something we should have added here actually, but we didn't. Output is going to help inform NX as to where any output files that were generated lie. So the main benefit that we want to cache for this end-to-end target is the console output actually. So if we ran this a second time with the same source code, it would just replay the same output. But in our current implementation here, we're missing the report that was generated, whereas this one will actually record that report and be able to put that back in the actual file system if this gets run again and we retrieve it from cache. So we'll keep that one there for E2E. I'm going to grab debug next. So debug is the same thing as we had mentioned here. So we're using the same executor. So this actually needs to be plugin like so. So we're matching this right here. All of this stuff stays the same. We actually don't need root here. So let's just get rid of that. So we can see debug is true, Chromium, and timeout. So this all matches here. So that looks good. Next is our show report. Show report's pretty easy, no options there. So drop that in. This needs to be plugin. And finally, lint, like so. So now our project configuration will be all set once we've run this. So this is going to adjust literally what's inside of our project.json file when the new project gets generated. The last thing we'll want to do here is add a linter. So I'm going to dump here after adding the files. We're going to add a linter here. So we'll drop this in. This is actually highly adjusted from NX's own Cypress generator for the Cypress project generator we run. We're going to add at the top here some imports from narwhal/linter. So that's where we get this lint project generator. We're going to add join path fragments here from NX dev kit. So this is just the standardized way that we have from the narwhal linter package to be able to set up ESLint for you automatically for any old generator. So once we have this all set up, we can await that now to await the linter adjustments, and then we're going to run this format files. This was added by the boilerplate, but we can see it here just coming in from the Angular dev kit. The idea here is once all the files are generated, so we're kind of layering onto this tree mutably as we go through. Each step is adjusting that tree object that got passed in initially. By the time we get to the end, everything has been set on the virtual file tree that needs to happen. And now we're going to run format files to essentially run the equivalent of prettier on those files to make sure everything is formatted appropriately. So we'll hit a save on that, and we'll be able to start testing this. So a quick mention on testing, we will be doing manual tests in this video just to make sure everything's working. But if you are interested in automated testing, we have set up here some spec files to test that the generators are working correctly via these unit tests on the individual generators. There is also the capability to run end-to-end tests on this. This is how we would run it inside of our actual Narwhal repository. So we can see we can await NX commands. Here we're generating a React app, removing the end-to-end application. That's the Cypress one that was generated with it. Then we're running the playwright init, and then we're running the playwright project here. So just going step by step. This is actually what we're going to go through and do manually. It would be better if we could do it automated, but unfortunately there's some bugs with this, with playwright running in the same context as Jest, that's preventing us from doing so here. But if you're making some other tools, the end-to-end tooling that we have built for NX plugins should work just fine. Be sure to check the repo if you're interested to see how those tests actually look, but we're going to go ahead and run some generators manually to see if our generators are working. So first step is we're going to use the NX console to generate just a regular React application. So we're going to call this test. We're going to turn off end-to-end test runner here so we don't have Cypress coming in. We're going to go ahead and run that now. So now from the command line we'll run npx nxg for generate, and we're going to use at Pokemon Supabase example / playwright plugin. So that's the name of our plugin package, and now we're going to write playwright project. I'm going to say front and project equals test. Let's hit a dry run on that before we actually run it, see how it looks. Cool, so this looks like it created our libs ete project JSON. It updated our workspace JSON. That's to add the test ete project in there. Playwright config is there. Our examples, our 2 example spec files that Playwright gives us is there. tsconfig is there, and the ESLint configuration file is there. So let's run this again without dry run. We'll see how this works. And there's our test ete project. Let's make sure everything came out all right. Looks all right. That looks fine, I hope. ESLint. Looks like that came out all right. Playwright config. Let's see, for the web server, we do have that npx nx serve test, so we should theoretically be able to run this right away. Remember, we said if we did pass in a front-end project, we would set this up automatically for the user, which I think we did there correctly. The other piece to check is this reporter. That looks like it came in good. Projects, let's check the targets, ete. Looks right. I think that all looks good. Perfect. All right, so here's the real test. We're going to run now npx nx e2e on test ete, and perfect. Looks like that run. Looks like that ran correctly. Let's try show report. Cool. That did what we expected it to. Let's try debug. This did open up on our other monitor. There you can see we're running through the example file that Playwright generated for us. Stepping through these. Looks like it all works. So the last piece of the puzzle is to publish this all to npm. So right now we have our Playwright plugin that's doing everything we need it to do inside of our own workspace. But if we wanted to share this with another project, say I want to use this on my side project, it would be great if I could just pull this down from npm to be able to use it that way. So fortunately, this is pretty easy. We're going to go to the NX console, and we're going to run a build now on our Playwright plugin. So we can just hit run there with the default information. And that went out and ran build for our Playwright plugin. So if we look now in our file directory, this is get ignored, but we can find it here in dist libs Playwright plugin. Here's everything that we need to send to npm right here. Let's look at the package.json file here real quick. Just to make this make sense a little bit more, I'm going to manually come in and adjust the package.json here. Narwhal video Playwright plugin to change the name so people don't see that there's really nothing Pokemon Super Base about the Playwright plugin, so we'll just adjust it like that. So all that's left to do now is run npm publish on our dist libs Playwright plugin like that. Hit enter. And voila, that published it out to npm. If we go into npm here and look for our plugin, there it is. Published just a few seconds ago. So cool. We can now, if we wanted to, we could npm install this and then run our init and then run our generators. And it should work in fine in any other NX workspace as well. So that's everything we set out to do in this video. As a recap, we created a Playwright plugin internally to our NX workspace. We created executors, we created generators, and we published it out to a centralized registry that is npm so that other NX workspaces could install that package and use the executors and generators inside of their own workspaces as well. This pretty much wraps up our series on the Pokedex Superbase example that we've been working on. We're going to go into some learner videos next, so be sure to like and subscribe. Send us any comments about the series. We'd be happy to answer any of them. And be on the lookout for more learner videos coming your way. See ya.